We're an educational, certified organic vegetable, herb, and flower farm, where during a normal year, we see over 8,000 children a year at our farm for field trips, for summer camp, and at 40 local school gardens. Obviously, this past year hasn't been a normal year, nor was it last year, but we're hoping good things for next year to be a little more normal. We also host special events at the farm and have workshops such as the one that we're doing this weekend for children and adults. And we sell our produce at the farm as well as at our local farmers market. If you'd like more information about the farm, please go to hollyhillfarm.org and you will find all kinds of information there about who we are and what we do. So we're incredibly grateful this evening for the generosity of our sponsors. And those sponsors are the Community Garden Club of Cohasset, the Cohasset Garden Club, and the Mass Cultural Councils of Hingham and Scituate. We thank you very much for your support this evening. Tonight's program is featuring Dr. Robert Gegear, a conservation biologist who's done extensive research on bumblebee populations and the plants that they pollinate. As some people call him affectionately, Dr. Bumblebee, he will talk primarily about how we can plant specific plants at home to support these pollinator-plant interactions and help the bees that are at risk. His focus is on the endangered variety of bumblebees known as Bombus fervidus. So now you can say another word for bumblebee, which is Bombus, and then you have a variety. As a follow-up to Dr. Gegear's presentation, naturalist Jasmine Callahan of Holly Hill Farm and of a native nursery in Norwell called Blue Stem Natives will join Dr. Gegear for a walk at the farm to learn about Beecology, which is a citizen science program that you can use on your computer or your smartphone. And that is designed to teach people how to observe bumblebees in nature and to record observations by taking short videos that will help scientists around the country who study the bumblebees. The scheduled walks are sold out, but if you would like to add your name to our wait list for a future walk, we would love to hear from you. So we'll let you know the next date for Dr. Gegear to lead additional walks at the farm. So thank you for your interest in this critically important subject. The future of our pollinators and native plants is at stake. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Robert Gegear.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Hope everybody can hear me okay. You never know with Zoom. So as was mentioned, I do focus on bumblebees, and I would say that I've studied them for over 30 years, so they have a special place in my heart. But you'll notice from the title of my talk, more than just the buzz, that it isn't just about bees or bumblebees. It's actually about the plants, and specifically native plants. And those native plants are what we're going to use to build biodiversity. And by biodiversity, I mean connections. So what the bees and other animals, butterflies, beetles, even wasps to some degree, are helping the plant to maintain these connections. So what I'm going to talk about today then is how this interaction between the animal and the plant, or the plant and its pollinators, how we can use that as a building block for biodiversity. So my talk is focused to get the biodiversity. We really are going to target these pollination systems at risk. That's both the animal side and the plant side of the equation. And so what I'm going to do is I've designed this talk to be more practical. So what do we need to do? What's the problem, first of all? Who are the players? So what is the difference between a flower visitor, a pollinator, and a pollination system? There's been a lot of talk about bees and saving the bees. The term pollinator is thrown in there, but more often than not, the term pollinator is misused. Pollinator is a plant-based term, yet we want to save the bees, but we're not thinking about the plant or the role that bee plays, or butterfly, as a pollinator. Why is that pollination as a ecological process is completely missed in all the discussion and what's currently going on in terms of quote unquote pollinator conservation. So we're going to talk about those differences, why I use the term pollination system, what it is and how, why it's important, and then what you can do to assess your property at different scales. You may have a garden, you may have conservation land. The same process applies. So how do we assess, and then how do we improve? I can say that the talk ends on a positive note. So through the help of so I do my own research, and then I started the Beecology project, as was mentioned. The citizen scientists are helping me to collect data. Collectively, we've come up with a plant list. People are putting these plants in, and guess what? They're supporting and attracting and these species at risk, and we're bringing in the plants that are in trouble as well. So it is far more than just the buzz, and hopefully at the end of this you'll see what I mean. I've been told, and I know I have a lot of information, so it's good that this is being recorded. I'm sure you're going to go back and look at some parts, but I always try to cut, but I feel it's just too important to cut, and maybe I'm a hoarder to some degree in terms of presentations, but I just feel that there's so much critical information that people don't know, and there are a lot of misconceptions out there. I'd say most of what's out there is, people think they're helping, but they're really not. In fact, in many cases, they're hurting. So we need to change things, and we are changing things, and things are improving. Anyway, so what I'm going to do, the talk's divided up into 3 parts. I'm going to, first of all, it's extremely important that we understand the difference between a flower visitor, a pollinator, a pollination system. Talk about the problem. What specifically is the problem? People think that everything's in trouble. Well, in fact, it's not. And appreciating that some things are doing quite well is important, because we really need to target those ones that are in trouble. Not everything's in trouble. And so what's going on is we're helping things that don't need any help. And in the process, we are driving the decline of the things that actually need our help. So we're going to try to balance that out. And then at the end, how is it that you can reconnect native plants and their pollinators, and talk about what I'm doing. And, I've had success in just 1 year. Started, putting in these habitats, and every plant that has bloomed has had one of the species at risk on it at the different plots that I have. So I'm excited about that, and looking to spread the word and to get other people to create these habitats. And in doing so, we're really going to help these species and prevent them from becoming locally extinct. Some of them are already, some species in the state are already locally extinct. So they're past the point of no return, but there are some that we can help. So I'll end with that. Okay, so we'll start off by talking about flower visitors. There are a wide variety of animals that visit flowers to feed on the nectar or the pollen, or both. Most of these animals are insects. You can see a wide variety of examples of insects, everything from flies to wasps. Bees get a lot of attention. Most of what's visiting is insects, but we certainly have some vertebrates that are important. The flower visitors. The fancy term for an animal that feeds on nectars, and a nectarovore. Those that feed on pollen are pollinivores. And so this is strictly animals that feed on nectar. So obviously there are a lot of different flower types out there. They have a wide variety of things to choose from, and they need to figure out which ones are good sources of nectar or pollen, which ones aren't so good. Things are changing. All of these animals are competing for resources, so resources are limited. And so, there's a lot going on from the flower visitor in terms of foraging behavior. So how is it that they select flowers? A lot of people think that they're innately attracted, like butterflies are innately attracted to blue. All these generalisms are out there. Although it is true that there are some species that have these innate preferences and are really fixed in what they like, the vast majority of insects and vertebrates that are visiting flowers are learning which flowers are good, remembering which ones are good, which ones are bad, and updating that information. So there's a lot of learning, memory, and cognition that goes on in their choices. And so just to give you one example, here we have our monarch butterfly that I'm sure a lot of you have seen flying around. We can touch the legs of the butterfly with cotton swab soaked in 20% sucrose solution. You can see its tongue comes out. It's like Pavlov's dog. It's an innate response, proboscis extension response. And then what we can do is we can show a color. You can see that there's no extension of the proboscis. So there's no innate response to the color. When we touch the legs with the sucrose solution, the tongue extends. As soon as the tongue touches the sucrose solution, it forms an association between that color and reward. And so we can pair it 1, 2, 3 times with reward. We can pair others with just water or saline solution, no reward. And then during the test, we can show the individual different colors. So we saw blue, here's a color that's similar to the training color. We see no response in the animal, but when we show the test color, we see a very rapid response. The tongue comes out, antennae are pointed down, that butterfly is looking for some food because it's formed this association. So associative learning. Butterfly, after just 1 or 2 pairings, can remember that without reinforcement for over a week. It can remember colors and odors and shapes for that length of time. And so even though, you know, insects, they have some very small brains, they're capable of quite amazing things. And when we go into the social bees, you know, that they can perform cognitively complex tasks. And they need that, again, because of the environment that they're in. Okay, so that's flower visitors. It's simply animals. If we see an animal visiting a flower, it's a flower visitor. Now, when can we start to call that animal a pollinator? Everybody looks at animals visiting flowers and they say, oh, there's a pollinator. This is a great pollinator plant. But as we'll see, the term pollinator plant is really meaningless. The pollinator is referring, so we need to switch things over to the plant perspective to use the term pollinator, first of all. And specifically, we need to look at plant reproduction. How is pollen moving? How is the animal moving pollen, if at all? So pollination is the process of pollen transfer from male to female reproductive organ, leading to fertilization and then fruit and seed production. So if an animal, while it's collecting food, so as a byproduct of it collecting food, if it's transferring pollen, leading to fertilization, so all of those elements are there, leading to pollination, that animal can be called a pollinator. If that doesn't occur, it's simply a flower visitor. So if we're going to a term, we need to think about the plant and what's going on in terms of plant reproduction if we're going to use the term pollinator, but everybody seems to confuse flower visitor with pollinator. So that's the first thing. Now, flowering plants, you know, most plants are flowering plants, and most flowering plants do require animals for pollination, so for reproduction. But there are a wide variety of different strategies that the plants use. Some do use wind and water, but they're ineffective modes of pollen transfer, right? So if you're trying to mate with a plant that's upwind, your pollen's blowing downwind, it's not a very efficient system. So the animals help to target, but there's certainly some plants that can fertilize themselves. They don't need the help of an animal or the wind or water, so they don't need, they can self-pollinate. The vast majority need to be outcrossed, so the animal needs to move to transfer pollen to another plant, right? So if you can imagine, we have our blue lobelia here, the bee or butterfly or whatever is moving up the inflorescence, transferring pollen to flowers of the same plant. So it's like it's mating with itself. If it's self-incompatible, unless that animal decides to move to another plant, this plant isn't going to reproduce, okay? So and so pollination, this idea of pollination is the key. That is why we are so concerned about bees and butterflies and everything that's visiting flowers. It's not the animal. Certainly the animal is important as a single species, but the process of pollination changes the game. If it actually pollinates, we now are helping the plant and helping the plant to help other wildlife. And this is why the plant really is the center of attention here, not the animal. The animal helps the plant to maintain its connections with other wildlife and help it to perform its function in the ecosystem. So just to give you a quick example, here we have obedient plant. We've got 2 bumblebee species. This is Bombus fervidus. This is Bombus affinis. This is the one that's locally extinct. We see Bombus fervidus is going into the flower, making contact with male and female reproductive organs. Bombus fervidus is a pollinator. Our Bombus affinis, on the other hand, is on the outside of the flower, and it's what's called a nectar robber. It's biting a hole at the base of the flower, and stealing the nectar, not making contact with the male and female reproductive organs. So Bombus fervidus is a pollinator, Bombus affinis is not. In fact, Bombus affinis in this example is a parasite, right? It is taking nectar and not providing anything in return to the plant. In fact, by draining the nectar, it's deterring our Bombus fervidus pollinator. So if we have 100 Bombus affinis visiting these obedient plants and no Bombus fervidus, we have no pollination, we have no pollinators, right? We're not, and we can't call Bombus affinis a pollinator until we introduce a plant that it actually makes contact, leading to fertilization and producing seeds and fruit. And if that never happens, then it never gets that label. And so when you say pollinator plant, what that assumes is that you're feeding the animal, and at some point in the future, it's going to perform, it's going to pollinate something. But unless you have the plant that it pollinates, it's not going to perform that function, right? So we want to make sure that we have the animals and plants connected, that the plants there with the animals that actually perform the pollination, right? That's when we can call. So we could set up, and we could take this plant out of the equation, and we could put a feeder in here, and we could support hundreds and hundreds of Bombus affinis, right? And prevent it from becoming locally extinct. But it does not, we've completely lost its function. It's functionally extinct because we're feeding it, but it's not performing its job as a pollinator. And this is an extremely important distinction, and one I'm going to come back to repeatedly in the talk, but this is where currently things are going wrong because people are confusing these things. Just to give you an example, so here it was pretty obvious, it's not making contact, it's not going in the flower, but in this case, this pineland golden trumpet, right, it's a tubular flower, things go in to get the nectar, so everything's going into this flower to some degree, but so pollen on the proboscis it's transferring pollen. It picks it up with its tongue and transfers it to other flowers. Only 3 out of the different species listed here, only 3 of them are actually pollinators. The rest are just flower visitors. And so from the plant's perspective, they want to keep their pollinators and get rid of, deter all these other ones. And they have a variety of mechanisms to do this. So there's this push and pull going on where the plant's trying to get its most effective, keep its pollinators and deter those that are acting more as a parasite, taking the nectar and not helping it to reproduce. And this interaction has driven the evolution of floral diversity in different floral shapes. You know, there's a lot of things going on here. But just, you know, be aware that even if you see tons of things going into a flower, it doesn't mean that they're all pollinating that plant, and that has important consequences. So things become a bit more, or much more complicated when we look at natural plant communities, right? If you go out to a conservation land or some open area, multiple things are in bloom. And so here we have our flower visitor, and indeed, let's assume that this bumblebee can pollinate to some degree all of these different plant species. If the bee decides that it wants to specialize on the purple flowers, from the plant's perspective, that's ideal, right? It's transferring pollen, keeping the pollen moving between individuals of the same species. But let's say this bee decides that it goes on a couple of purples, but it also gets just as much reward from the pink. So it goes from purple to pink to yellow. From the plant's perspective, this is the worst case scenario. The pollen's being transferred to another species, so you can't mate with another species, so you're effectively wasting your male gametes. And the other thing that happens is that the heterospecific pollen blocks the surface of the stigma, the female reproductive organ, preventing it from receiving its own pollen. So it's very costly from the plant. So it's not just whether you have animals in the system that are pollinating, it's how they move. And when we hit this bee with pesticides and it can't think straight, right, we affect its cognitive functioning, it may forage randomly and have consequences for the plant. And so the bee is choosing to select flowers based on the rewards, right? It's all about the nectar and pollen. And is it accessible? How much is it going to get per unit time? So it's foraging proficiency that affects its reproductive success. It doesn't care about plant reproduction. And so people think of plants and pollinators as this nice, beautiful mutualism where they're helping one another out. Well, that's not the case. I mean, it is because of what's called plant-pollinator conflict. They're battling with one another. The plant wants the bees, the animals to specialize, and the animal is trying to maximize its rate of energetic gain, it's going to do whatever it takes to do that, right? And this has helped to drive the evolution of floral complexity, floral display complexity, why we see different colors, odors, and shape. And most of my research focuses on this relationship between these two things. But that's the system, and we're talking about a good number of species on either side, right? 300,000 roughly flowering plant species globally, and there are about 200,000 known species of flower visiting animals. And so what we see then is that there isn't a single animal that can pollinate everything over here, and there isn't a single plant that could feed everything on this side. And what we see are these subsets. The plant has a subset of targets a subset of animals for pollination, and most animals are targeting a subset of plants to forage for food. And if we look at both of those things together, so we look at the plant and all of its pollinators, that's what we refer to as a pollination system. So you can see that the flower visitor pollinator confusion, because people are forgetting about the plant's role, with the term pollination system, it forces you to think about the plant, because by definition, it's the plant and pollinator together. And there are a wide variety of these pollination systems. Some plants are adapted for bumblebee pollination, and you can see the pollen on the thorax of this bumblebee. Why is it here? Because it's very difficult for the bee to groom this off. Bees are collecting pollen to feed their young, right? The larvae need pollen also to help to build the nest, but the plant needs the pollen for reproduction. So it's trying to minimize how much that bee can take. You can see the proboscis extended here. The bee goes into the flower to get the nectar, and the pollen rubs up here. In our hummingbird pollinated, right, the nectar's down here. We can see that the pollen is transferred to the forehead. So this plant has evolved the structure that deposits the pollen on the forehead of the hummingbird. Why? Because if it deposited on the wings, it's going to lose all its pollen. It's not a very efficient system. As the butterfly, or as the hummingbird moves in to feed on the nectar, this is the female part. So it's sliding the pollen, its forehead is brushing up against the female part as it goes in to get the nectar and picking up the pollen, and then it'll move to another plant. And the first thing it does is touch the female part and then pick up the male. So you can see that the order's right. Here's a fly pollinated system, right? There are fly pollination systems. There are butterfly pollination systems. So when I say more than just the buzz, this is just one of many of these systems. All of these systems are equally important. And I focus on bumblebees because it's easy for people to identify them and relate to them. There are, 4,000 bee species in North America. Most of them you wouldn't even notice. They're so small, right? So this is the the gateway animal and the gateway system. But all of these to me are equally important. And in fact, we're expanding the Beecology project this year to include butterflies, and will include other systems as well. This fly system is interesting. Here's the pollen. This is a one-to-one, right? The plant depends on one pollinator, one animal for pollination, and this animal feeds exclusively on the nectar of this plant. And so clearly, so we have difference in how generalized these systems are. Some plant species have multiple pollinators, some only have a single pollinator. Similarly, we have a couple of species that are specialists. They only collect nectar or pollen from one or two species. So it's very complicated. To give you an example, here's a bumblebee pollination system. This is bottle gentian. This is Bombus vagans, one of the species at risk. In order for this bee to get the nectar, it has to pry open the petals of the flower. And so you can see that this bee's working away trying to get inside that flower. Bumblebees are the only thing that have the strength to get in there to get that nectar. Again, that's the way that the plant excludes individual flower visitors that wouldn't pollinate effectively. Eventually the bee gets in, you can see it there. If I had the sound on, it's buzzing as it does that. You can see it grooming the pollen, and it goes off to find another bottle gentian. So only about 20 to 30% of those bumblebees will find the nectar in this bottle gentian. And so why is it that the plant would exclude pollinators, potential pollinators? And the answer is, or the reason is, because the nectar builds up in here. And so for those few individuals that are able to find the nectar. There's so much nectar, more than anything else available. It specializes, it'll travel far and wide to find another bottle gentian, and that's the way that the plant maximizes that pollen transfer efficiency. They're not meddling, they're not going to other plant species, they're sticking with the bottle gentian. All right, so hopefully at this point we have an understanding of the difference between a flower visitor, a pollinator, and a pollination system. And we really need to understand things from the plant perspective to apply that label as a pollinator. So when we look at these systems, the problem is that these systems are in serious trouble. Globally, they're being degraded at an alarming rate. Over the past 20 years, we've been losing species from both the animal side of the equation and the plant side of the equation. So here are some data from Massachusetts looking at bumblebees pre-2000. So we started to see bumblebee declines, significant declines, the late 90s, early 2000s. So pre-2000 is the blue bars, 2015 to 19. So more recent data that I collected at the same site where I got where they got the pre-2000 data from. And you can see that in Bombus terricola, there's a significant drop. Bombus affinis is the one that's locally extinct. So it used to be one of the most abundant species at lower elevations. Now we can't find it anywhere. But what I want to point out, and so that's the same for butterflies. And so this is showing, the green is showing, the red we'll start with is showing declines here. All these species are in decline. And we're seeing the same thing in plants, right? We're seeing that there are a number of plant species that are in rapid decline. And so again, in our pollination systems, we may, if we get a decline on the plant side, we're going to get a corresponding decline here. And also if we start to lose animals that are major pollinators of some of these plants, that's certainly going to accelerate the decline. So both of those things, not surprisingly, are linked together. The Penstemon hirsutus, this one here, is a favorite of the bumblebee species in decline. So it's not really a surprise that this one's in decline as well. But what I want to point out is that you'll notice that in the case of the bumblebees, there are many cases where the yellow bar is much higher than the blue bar. So while it's true, we're a lot of, and the same with the butterflies, and it's also the same with the native plants. So while we do have some species that are in serious trouble, others are doing better than they've done historically and actually expanding their ranges. And so when we think about building biodiversity and conserving biodiversity, we really need to think about who's in trouble. We need to target who's in trouble, and we need to, there's not a one size fits all approach, clearly, because whatever we're doing to drive some species to extinction, we're helping others out. And part of, or a lot of what I'm doing research wise is trying to figure out why we get these differential declines across the board. And so, the systems are in trouble. So why should we care, right? Why should we, there's Save the Bees campaign, Save the Pollinators, Pollinator Gardens. Why do we care? And it comes down to not the animal, it comes down to its functional role as a pollinator. It comes down to pollination. Why is pollination important? There are two contexts where pollination is important. The first one gets a lot of attention. So, if you mention pollinator decline, immediately people think of honeybees and food on our table. And that certainly is important and gets a lot of attention. But I want to point a couple of things out before I talk about the second reason why pollination is so important. So here we've got our agro ecosystems. We've got a few species that are doing most of the pollinating. The non-native honeybees are tremendously important in an agricultural context. Why? Because there are, in a single hive, there's 10 to 30,000 individuals. And those 10 to 30,000 individuals have to pollinate all of this. Acres and acres of monoculture. And so what we have, there are a few native species that also help to pollinate crop plants. But, as I mentioned, there are thousands of native bee species, only 5, let's say, are important in agriculture. The vast majority are not. In fact, if we look at all the native species of flower visiting animal, only about 5% of them are visiting crop plants. So we've got a handful of species pollinating a handful of plants, right, that aren't native. They may have been native at some point, but we've engineered them to produce food for us, which is perfectly fine. And it's feeding one species, or we could add domesticated animals, a subset of species, certainly a limited number of species. And obviously we're an important species. So all of this is extremely important. But here, all that matters is abundance of bees. Why? Because butterflies aren't great pollinators at this scale. Bees come in the thousands, and so bees play an important role as crop pollinators, and therefore that's the focus. So it doesn't matter how many kinds of bees, how many species we have, all that matters is we have enough of them. And so we can flood the system with honeybees and get the job done. And that's what's being done. Honeybees aren't great pollinators of buzz pollinated plant, crops like tomato. And so we bring bumblebees into greenhouses to do that. They're also not very good at blueberry. So we bring bumblebees in. One species, the common eastern bumblebee, is used to, for crop pollination in North America. So bee abundance is important, and clearly this is important. But when we switch to look at ecology, the ecological importance of pollination, the game changes completely. It's here what matters is the number of pollination systems we have, the diversity of those systems, right? We need the animal and we need the plant diversity. Why? Because that diversity at this level is providing food, shelter, and nest sites for for birds and small mammals and other wildlife, right? So the more diversity we have, the more diversity we have at this level, the more feeding options, the more nesting options that they have. And then of course, the diversity at this level is going to be feeding things at this level, right? Because they're prey items. And so we can think of these systems, they're called, the plant pollinator interactions are called keystone interactions, because they are far more important than just the two species that are interacting, right? Everything that's using that plant is a part of this interaction and is supported by that pollination event. And so what these systems do, diversity of systems and these keystone interactions are supporting diversity at these other levels. I will say that the honeybee, right, non-native species, not just the honeybee, but also non-native plants, play no role in here, right? It's that each one of our native plants has native animal partners, and the native animal partners are focused on exploiting native plants. And so that's the system. When we introduce non-natives, it's disrupting the balance. And there are a large number of ways that a non-native plant can disrupt this, and also a non-native pollinator as competitors, right? Non-native plants are competing for pollinators with native plants. And non-native here, we can talk about things from Europe and Asia. We'll talk a bit more about cultivars. So why is this important? Clearly with the agriculture, what's important is our food supply. It's important that our pollination systems are providing food for hundreds of other species, right? But there's no, the argument is there's no dollar value. So why should we care, right? In agriculture, there's clearly economic gain, and here there doesn't appear to be, but in fact there is. Why? Because our healthy and diverse ecosystems, again, that have these systems at their foundation, to some extent, provide us with what are called ecosystem services. These are things we get from nature for free that we completely take for granted, right? Pollination is one, but the pollination here is for agricultural, right? Our wild animal flower visitors are going to act as pollinators. But there's, carbon sequestration, medicines, there's the, here are some examples of these ecosystem services. And I can tell you that as we start to take away the diversity of these systems, eventually what's going to happen is we're going to take away too many, and we're going to start to affect these levels, other levels, and we're going to get a massive reduction in biodiversity. We're going to get what's called ecosystem collapse. When that happens, we are going to rapidly lose all of these things, and some of them we can't replace. We'd have to invent some way to mimic what's going on in nature, if we can. So we're really going to be in serious trouble, and there's going to be a significant price tag. But because it isn't as obvious as crop production, where we can see what's produced year to year, this is rather invisible. It's not getting the attention. And so what I'm trying to do is to make people aware of this potential ecological catastrophe, and trying to maintain these connections and maintain the health of diversity and diversity of these ecosystems. So just to give you a quick example, we've got a bumblebee visiting a blackberry flower. It's providing food for this small mammal, and this small mammal is providing food for owls. So interestingly, owls are in trouble. They feed primarily on voles, and so those voles need something to eat, and they are relying on these products of pollination. Same with seed-eating birds, that the birds are then themselves food for higher trophic levels. So everything is connected. And again, it's the native plant, the animal is pollinating the native plant so that it can perform its function and help and contribute to these other trophic levels to maintain these connections. So hopefully you can see that. So if we look at the difference between saving flower visitors and saving a pollination system, everybody has a hummingbird feeder, which is great. And you are certainly, the hummingbirds can get by without the feeders, but people like their hummingbird feeders. And so here we're saving the hummingbirds, great. But we aren't saving pollinators, right? Similarly, if we put non-native plants like the European honeysuckle, these birds love European honeysuckle, we can feed the birds and sustain the bird populations. But if we lose their role as pollinators. So here are some native plants. Obviously, if we have native plants out, and we put up a hummingbird feeder, what are the birds going to do? You have one-stop shopping and an unlimited food source versus you have to visit thousands of flowers and keep making trips back and forth and competing and exposing yourself to predators the more time you're out. So of course they're going to select this. But when they do that, these plants don't get pollinated and they lose their function. So here we're saving the birds, no problem. But by planting Monarda, by planting the cardinal flower, we're preserving their role as pollinators and we're helping biodiversity, right? We need to think about that. Again, the plant plays the key role here. The plants that are pollinated by hummingbirds, we need to get into the system because there are likely animals that specialize or love the seeds or love to nest in those plants, and we need to make those available. So it's not just the animal, it's the plant and the animal together that we need to help to reconnect those two together. All right, so why do we have these, why are systems being degraded? There are a number of potential threats out there. Pesticides, certainly the neonicotinoids in agricultural and urban areas are a problem. My labs, we're looking at all of these, published work on a lot of these, and so for pesticides and disease, certainly they're contributing, but the major driver is this habitat change and loss of habitat, and so I'm going to focus the talk here. How is it that we can restore habitat? Obviously, don't use pesticides. There are diseases moving from honeybees to native bumblebees. So, try to keep them on agricultural land where they're important. They're not in ecosystems where they don't play a role, that type of thing. Climate change is moving plants around, it's shifting systems. But the habitat change and loss here, we need to, the question then is, well, what do we need to do, right? People have provided plant lists and potential answers, but it turns out that they're not actually, they're not doing what many people think that they're doing, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I'm going to focus mostly on habitat change and loss and what we can do to remedy the situation. So now I'm going to shift to giving you some practical things. How can we reconnect the native plants with their pollinators? In particular, focusing on these pollination systems at risk. The first thing is that we need to target the pollination systems at risk. Now, in doing this, we're not excluding the common plants or common pollinators. They will be in the system no matter what we do, but what we're presently doing is excluding them. So the idea here then is, obviously, if we want to fix things, we want to target these species at risk, we got to figure out what is it that they're missing. What did we do that affected them? How are we affecting them? And so, you know, each species has its own ecological preferences, its own set of needs, its own niche, if you will. And that's going to depend on what we're trying to help, right? So butterflies, they need a host plant and they need a nectar plant. So we can put in all the flowering plants that we want, but unless we have the host plants close by, we're not going to be helping out the butterflies. The monarch is a, you know, is a good example, but not a common, not a typical example, in that the monarchs specialize here. So you put in milkweed, and then as adults, they're more generalists. So here they're specialists and here they're generalists. But the point is that we need both of these things within the range of the butterfly. Otherwise, if they're disconnected, we can't keep the population going. All bees have the same general cycle. So they overwinter. So we need to find a place for them. We have to create places for them to overwinter. They come out and they need to find a nest site. Once they find a nest site, they need nectar and pollen. The pollen is how they make new bees. The nectar is their source of fuel. So if we don't have good sources of pollen, we'll have lots of bees flying around, but we won't be able to keep the population going because we can't create new bees. At the end, they mate and then they overwinter, and that completes the cycle. So the question then is do you have what the species at risk actually need? And that's a great question, and one that I've focused my research on to figure out what the species need, because what people have been told they need is not actually what they need. They don't like the plants that people are putting in. And so I've spent a lot of time since 2015 collecting data and created the Citizen Science Project, which I'll talk about in a second, to collect data to figure out what they want. And I now know what they want. And again, I'm putting it in and getting positive results. So we'll get there in a second. But the first thing that you need to consider is that timing is everything, right? A lot of people, with the gardens and the quote unquote pollinator habitats, things don't start to bloom until early June. Maybe you'll have one or two things late May, but these animals are out as soon as the snow melts, right? And so if we look at different species at risk, you can see here's their flight activity as adults. You can see that some are active early in the spring, some are active later in the summer. Here's an example of a bee, Andrena bee. It finishes its life cycle by mid-May. So if we don't have anything in bloom in March and April, this bee is done for, right? And for some reason this got cut off, but this is bloom times. Here are a bunch of native plant, or there's some non-natives in here, obviously. But just give you an example of bloom times. You can see that some of them are blooming early, some of them bloom later, right? Like your goldenrod, and we can see overlap between natives and non-natives. So what we want to do is make sure that we match up, pick our plants that have bloom times that match the species at risk that we're trying to help, right? And so that's the first point. And as I mentioned, that the spring bloomers are absolutely critical for species at risk. So let's just look at willow. So, everybody thinks pussy willow. Well, there are, a dozen native willow species. They all come in different forms. Some are shrubby. They bloom at different times, right? But the key thing here is that all of the threatened bees that are out in the spring are using willow as a source of nectar, and the male willows are producing pollen. That's their source of nectar and pollen. All of these butterflies are at risk. They're flying around in the spring looking for nectar, so they'll feed on willow. And also, this butterfly species at risk uses it as a host plant, right? So just by putting in willow in the spring, you're able to support these things. If they don't have food, they're not going to make it to your plants in June. And that's a problem. There's this bias to mid to late summer, definitely in the autumn. Everybody wants asters and goldenrods, which are nice, but you need things in place to get the things that you like to look at, right, to the asters and goldenrods. And so, it's important. Spring is definitely underrepresented in terms of what people have in their gardens. The second thing is you need to identify your targets. What do these things look like? How do I know if I'm helping one? And so a lot of what I do, and what I'll be doing on Saturday, is teaching people how to tell the species at risk from the common species. We'll focus on bumblebees. I've got information on the butterflies. and some other things that are at risk, but you need to know your targets. Obviously, if you're putting, I'm really I have a plant list, and I'll talk about the plant list, and you certainly could put in the plant list and just assume that I'm right, but I don't want you to assume that I'm right. I want you to put the plants in. I want you to see what you have, put the plants in, and then see that you've made a difference. It's extremely important to me to see, for people to see that they've made a difference in helping these species at risk. It could be putting in some of the plant species in trouble and seeing them thrive and seeing everything that's visiting them that wouldn't be there otherwise. And if you happen to see one of the bumblebee species at risk and you're supporting it and you see those numbers grow from year to year, you know that you're helping to contribute to that population increase, or at least sustaining the population. And so I have, there's the Beecology web app, and I have other information handouts that I'm happy to give you if you email me to help you to identify the targets. And so this is what I can send you. Here are the bumblebee species that historically were in Massachusetts. The social species, I don't have the parasitic species on here. This is Bombus affinis, the one that's locally extinct, but everything with a red box is in trouble. Here's the target for the area for Eastern Mass. Bombus fervidus is one, and Bombus vagans up here is the other one. And so those are the ones that we're trying to help. They both have long tongues. They both fit with tubular flowers, that many of which are also in decline. And so that's the pollination system that we're trying to introduce and round things out so that we have that diversity of pollination systems to support wildlife diversity. So the third point is an important one, and that is let the concept of Umwelt guide your decision. So what's Umwelt? I apologize for my German is non-existent basically, except for a couple of words. Zugenru is the other one. That's from teaching animal behavior. But anyway, the term refers to experiencing things from the perspective of the animal, right? We have what we think are beautiful flowers. How could, they're nice showy flowers. We've got cultivars, we've bred them, we think that they're great, and nothing's going to touch them, right? Because they don't have what these animals need. So what we need to do is look at things from their perspective. So one of the things we can look at is their tongue length, right? So short tongue bees, like this is the common eastern bumblebee, has a medium tongue length, but it visits this goldenrod. The nectar is open, accessible. That's why we see a lot of different things on goldenrod with short tongues. Honeybees love goldenrod because they have short tongues. They can get to the nectar. But our species in trouble with the long tongues, they're not going to touch a goldenrod. Their long tongues get in the way and they can't compete with the short to medium tongue bees here. So what they're looking for is something like this orange touch-me-not. Notice the spike. The nectar is located at the base of the spike. This is our Bombus fervidus. Its tongue can wrap around to get right to the bottom, to the tip of that spur. And so this is what they're looking for. Why? Because they have a competitive advantage. Their long tongue makes them able to extract nectar where the short tongue bees couldn't get the nectar at the base of the spur. And so we can plant all the aster and goldenrod we want. We're not going to have any Bombus fervidus on the scene until we look at things from its perspective. It's a long tongue bee. It's looking for tubular flowers because that's how it gets its competitive advantage. There are other ways too to determine what those animals want. We can guess, obviously, with tongue length, but the key here is that we need to go out and we need to observe them. Let the species tell us what they want. And so this is what I've been doing. I go out to sites across Massachusetts, into Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and I survey bee flower interactions. How are the bees behaving? Are they collecting nectar and pollen? And I put all the data together and I look for patterns to see what these species prefer. And here are some data from July at one of my field sites. And I've divided here are the bumblebee species down here, short, medium, and long tongue. You notice that there's a pattern, right? Long tongue bees like red clover and vetch. Why? Because they have long tubes and they have a competitive advantage. Our short tongue bees are on milkweed and goldenrod. Not surprising because those are open and easily accessible. Our medium tongue bees fall in between, but what you notice is that even though these bees are the same size here, roughly, same tongue length and size here and here, each species has a different preference. So there were 25 plant species where I saw a bumblebee, but you'll notice that in every case, every species over 50 or 60%, definitely over 50% of its visits were to just 2 species out of the 25. And they're very different. So what this tells us is that there's more to it than tongue length. The bush Bombus perplexus loves bush honeysuckle, and so does Bombus vagans. This suggests that there's something in the nectar chemistry, and I'm working with collaborators to figure out what this is. But you can see that if we just went under the assumption that tongue length is the only thing that matters and ignored this, we would miss that Bombus vagans loves bush honeysuckle, and there are others on other species as well, native species. This is the native bush honeysuckle that Bombus vagans loves. And so we can look and compare different sites to figure out what they like for nectar. Now, when we look at pollen, right, remember they need pollen to make new bees. The same thing, this is looking in July, that we've got the medium, short, long-tongue bees. I've got the designation up here, but what we notice is that there's a dramatic difference. They're all using the same plants for pollen because tongue length doesn't matter when you're collecting pollen. And so there's strong competition here. So if our pollen plants are limited, we're going to get winners and losers. Some aren't going to get enough pollen, and that's going to affect their population, right? Because they need the pollen to make new bees. And so why they love pollen from certain species, like the native roses they love. Purple flowering raspberry is an amazing pollen plant. It blooms for 3 weeks, and it's just covered with the species at risk when it's in bloom. So we need to, when we're thinking about what the animal wants, it's telling us, I want this plant for nectar and I want this plant for pollen. And we need to consider that when we're forming our plant list and deciding what we're going to put in our yard to help to support them and increase the biodiversity. So you notice, if we go back, that the vetch and red clover are non-native. So the question is, what is the native plant that non-native is substituting for, right? The native plant is the connector. So here we're feeding the animals, and yes, they may be pollinating, but these plants aren't supporting other wildlife the same way that the native plants that they would be visiting would support them, right? So definitely vetch and red clover is these 2 species. That's the reason that these 2 are still around. If we cut all the vetch and red clover out and kept it mowed, these species would be locally extinct. There's no question, because in the spring, this is what they're exclusively feeding on, unless there are these native plant alternatives. And so what I did, again, through going to different sites, comparing areas where we've got native plants and vetch and red clover present, here are the plants, the native plants that substitute for the vetch and red clover. And so in the spring, lupin and wood betony are major nectar sources. Moving into the penstemons hirsutus and then digitalis. This one blooms first and second. Into the monardas, prunella vulgaris, and then into the fall into jewelweed. So just by planting the 5, 6 species here, 7, you've got nectar for these long-tongue bee species at risk. And interestingly, this one's a short tongue. It's found in Western Mass. But it's a hole biter, and so all these tubular flowers it feeds on as well. It doesn't necessarily pollinate, but you'll be supporting this one, and the system can accommodate that degree of nectar robbing from that species, which is why it's able to persist. That's the special behavior that it has to allow it to compete. And then in terms of pollen plants, willows into the native roses, purple flowering raspberry should be in here, meadowsweet, and then we could put in St. John's wort. That's the pollen. And so that by putting these plants in, we can not only support, but also increase the populations of these species at risk. All of these species, by the way, and I have a student looking at this, their main pollinators are these species. So we're maximizing pollination, the output of these plants, the seed production, plant material with these species in the system, and putting these native plants in, so restoring those plant pollinator systems. As I mentioned, the science, I'm one individual. I do a lot of survey work. I now have some grad students that are I work on the project. I've had grad students in the past, but the amount of data that I need over the range that I need it from, it's just impossible to do. So to help me, I created the Beecology Citizen Science Project. So the project started with people sending me videos of bees interacting with flowers. And that transformed, so I collaborated with some computer science faculty at WPI. We created a web app to help people to collect data, submit it to our database. And so I can take my field data and compare it to the Beecology data. Beecology data also shows me where these species at risk are located, so I can go and study them more intensively. So the Beecology project, there are hundreds of people participating in the project at this point, and it has been extremely helpful. And I appreciate every individual that's participated in the project a great deal, because it's really helped to move things forward, to collect the data, to get these plant lists, and now help to restore these habitats. And so it started with just bumblebees. As I said, we're expanding it. And it started with data collection, but now you can see that we're using it to train people on how to assess habitat, and also using the data that was collected and to restore and protect these native pollination systems. And here's a sign that I've designed that, you know, if you want to put in one of these habitats, I've got these signs that I'm sending to get printed on you know, aluminum signs that you can put up in these areas where that can be used for research and education purposes. You know, email me if you want to know more about that, or more to participate in the project. And if you go to the website, that we have a Beecology website, we've got a lot of information. We're developing high school curriculum around the Beecology project, and so there's a lot on the site. If you have any further questions, feel free to shoot me an email. To give you an idea of the app, we got the Beecology app. What you do is go out and just take a 10-second video of a bumblebee interacting with a flower. The app will help you to ID the bee, and then you can use, I'm contacting iNaturalist to be able to use their app, so we can incorporate their app into our app to help with the plant identification, and then that information gets sent to our database, and then you can look at your there's a map on the Beecology site, and you can look to see what others have found in your area and what you found. So it's, you know, it's a, I'm moving through it fairly quickly, and I'll talk more about it on the walk on Saturday. But again, if you have any other questions, just shoot me an email about that. All of the data collected from the Beecologists and also from my own lab data has gone into this native plant risk, which is available on my lab website, gegearlab.weebly.com. And here you can see that, again, it's not just here are the bumblebee species at risk, but I've got information on all the butterfly species considered at risk or in decline in the state, other bee species that are in decline, information about when they're active, the bloom times. You know, if you have full shade, medium soil, you can just go down the list and find something that is best suits the conditions in your yard or on your conservation land. And you can pick things that maximize the number of species at risk that you're helping, okay? And we'll talk about the success stories, as I said, in a second. But before I get there, you know, I just want to contrast what I'm doing with what is out there and just point out a couple of things. The traditional pollinator conservation strategy, as I mentioned, the term pollinator is used when actually the term flower visitor is more appropriate. Why? This is a list from pollinator.org, which is one, you know, I could have pulled one from Xerces or some of the other major pollinator, quote unquote, conservation groups, but you'll notice that, you know, it's a one size fits all approach. So for bumblebees, the idea is you just pick a couple plants here and you're helping the bumblebees. Well, I just got finished showing you that red clover is extremely important for the species at risk, yet it's not even checked here. Also, there are a ton of non-native species. So that's feeding the animals, certainly, but it's not conserving their role as a pollinator. Their role as a pollinator is with native plants. There are species here that are rarely visited by bumblebees. So I'm not sure what went into this list, but my list is data driven, and certainly as data comes in, the list gets adjusted, and so, you know, it's more dynamic. But there are good ones here, like penstemon is great, and rose is great as a pollen source, but it's not listed as a pollen source. So just randomly picking isn't going to do it. So what I'm hoping is that what I'm doing will prompt others to be more specific or data driven in terms of what they're telling people to put in, especially when we go to Western North America where the species all change, but the problem is still there. They're still getting lists of non-natives, and we're not restoring those pollination systems. The seed mixes are another problem. You know, here's bee buddies, right? What do you notice here? There are no tubular flowers. There are no pollen sources. Most of these aren't native or they're cultivars. So this is helping honeybees effectively, but nothing else. Here, there are a couple of good plants, but there are no pollen plants here. So again, it's just thinking more about what is your goal. If your goal is just to have showy flowers and have some things buzzing around, great, you know. But if you want to conserve something, if biodiversity conservation is your goal, then you need to think a bit more about what you're putting in and what actually, how it's functioning, who's it helping and what's it doing. And I certainly can help you with that. The fourth point I want to make is that cultivars are definitely not the same as straight species. There's, you know, in some cases, possibly in terms of a nectar source, but this is some work from Annie White, University of Vermont. I've seen this myself. It's just she's got it in a nice presentable way and has graphs and things. But it's very clear that they don't respond the same way to cultivars and hybrids that they do to the straight species. So here's Echinacea as one example. Here are the different color variants. So each of the bars corresponds to the color variant. You can see that the straight species here, all bees, you know, they're not visiting the cultivars. Bumblebees down, even honeybees are down, butterflies and moths are down, depending on the cultivar. So it's not the same as the straight species. And why is that? It's because when you breed something for one thing, so let's say we're breeding for a showy flower, the plant has limited resources and it's going to pull resources from somewhere else. And more often than not, it's nectar production. And so here's an example for the cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. Remember, it's our hummingbird pollinated plant species, primarily hummingbird pollinated. And we can see here's both of these look identical, but not to the bird. Here comes that umwelt again, right? Here's the nectar in the straight species. Here's the nectar in the hybrid. And you can see that the bird's just not going to touch it. And I've seen this more often than not. Someone told me it was a straight species. Nothing's visiting it. I checked the nectar and there's no nectar. And then I go back and they're like, oh, well, yeah, it's this cultivar, but it's like the straight species. And then I inform them that, no, it's not like the straight species. So, you know, even if it did have equivalent nectar, the problem is that its function, right, its connection with those other animals may be lost. So it may not, butterflies might not want to use it as a host plant, or things might not want to eat it. They might not like the seeds, right? You're changing the nectar chemistry. You're changing a lot more than just the flower when you create these cultivars, and you need to keep that in mind. All right, so what can you do to increase the biodiversity? Again, I'm going to finish with the steps that you know, things you need to consider. So, you know, the first thing is you need to go out and see what you actually have. Take an ecological inventory. You can start with your plant species. What plant species are in bloom? Are they native or non-native? You can put the flowers that you have into different categories. Are they all composites? Are they tubular? Do you have and then you can switch over to the animals. Do you have any of these species at risk present? Right. So you may have vetch and red clover and have these species present. Then you might want to think about introducing the natives that they like, and then swap the natives in and eventually reduce the number of the non-native, right? So you don't want to just eliminate it. You want to introduce the native, and then once the native numbers go up to support these bees, then you can take it out and you've reconnected the plant and their pollinators, right? The second is you want to decide what it is you're going to change. In many cases, this is more applicable to conservation lands. It may be removing non-natives and invasives rather than putting things in. So here's an example from Breakneck Hill Conservation Land. It's my first study site, and I'm doing quite a bit at this site. It's 40 acres or so. And so 40 acres, lots of native plants, lots of non-natives as well through here. But down in this wet meadow area, filled with purple loosestrife, right? Tons of honeybees on the purple loosestrife, and lots of the common eastern bumblebee. So lots of the common species, but none of the species at risk. They're on the vetch and red clover in low numbers up here. So we removed the purple loosestrife. And once that was removed, so we hand pulled a lot of it the first year, and then they used other means to get rid of the loosestrife in other years. But just year three after removing that, what happened? Instead of loosestrife, we have native mimulus, monkey flower, coming up. Guess who shows up on the mimulus? Our species at risk, right? All of these other native plants showed up where the purple loosestrife was. So loosestrife is invasive. What it does is, there's a limited space from the plant's perspective. Loosestrife takes all the space and suppresses germination. So the seeds are there and they're ready to go, but the loosestrife suppressing, you remove the loosestrife and you get all this native plant diversity coming up, and you're reconnecting the plants with the species at risk, and they're moving from those vetch and red clover in the rest of the field down here to visit these plants. So that's removing from an area. The other thing you want to do is to limit the non-native flower visitors. So in conservation areas, the honeybee is, in agricultural areas, it's tremendously important. But in areas where you're trying to conserve things, it is a competitor. It's non-native. It doesn't pollinate any native plant, or it may pollinate, but no native plant depends on honeybees for pollination because it's not a part of the system. And so what happens is, because it's numbers, it just swamps any system. It becomes a problem. And so here's an example. This is Monarda fistulosa rubra. So it's a subspecies of wild bergamot. And before the honeybee, so looking at the last week of July, right? So just in a single week, the honeybee numbers went from 1 or 2 to hundreds. So the last week of July, our species at risk all over our Monarda, right? And then after the first week of August, we started to see the honeybees increase. Before that, we started to see carpenter bees. The carpenter bees are biting holes at the base of the Monarda, shown here. It's not the same species, but it's the same idea. Bites holes here because it's a nectar robber. With the low numbers of carpenter bees in the system, our bombus long-tongued bees are still going in, doing their pollinating and getting nectar. As soon as the honeybees, because they have a short tongue, this carpenter bees opened up the resource. We've got hundreds, literally hundreds. This is one observation period. There was over 100 honeybees on this patch of Monarda and none of our long-tongued bees. They moved out somewhere else. So it literally, the honeybee numbers pushed them off. Looking at things like mountain mint, right? So mountain mint isn't catering to the needs of our species at risk, but just to show you, on one Monarda plant in the same area, I counted 100 honeybees. There were 12 common eastern bumblebees and none of the bumblebee species at risk. And goldenrod, it's the same thing. It's a 10-to-1 ratio of honeybees to the common bumblebees, let alone other bees and the species at risk, where it's skewed much more of a skew. So we just need to think about what's the function and what are we doing on the conservation land, and we want to try to minimize the non-native plants as well as the non-native flower visitors that are acting as competitors. So to maximize the diversity, then you want to pick species, and again, this is from my list, that maximize the range of connection. So here we've got a native rose. All the bees are using it for pollen. It's a host plant for the apple sphinx moth, and the apple sphinx moth is a food source for our eastern whippoorwill. The rose hips are food for all of the bird species shown here. So just by putting in our native roses, we are able to affect all of these species in a positive way and potentially have them support them in our area. Willow was another example, and the other thing that I want to point out here is it doesn't have to be showy. Grasses are extremely important. Seed-eating birds love native grass seed. It's their #1 preferred food item. All right. We've got butterflies that are using them as host plants. Rodents are using our native grasses as nest sites. And why is that important? Well, the rodents are feeding our owls and also our bumblebees. They don't make their own nests. They don't dig holes. They use abandoned rodent nests to create their nests. So if we get rid of rodents and we don't have any, we're mowing our grasses, preventing rodents from nesting, doesn't matter what we have in bloom, we're not going to have our bumblebees, our bumblebee species at risk nesting, because that's what they're looking for. So we want to maintain the grasses to keep all of these, to keep this part of the system going. And it's also not just about the food. You know, there are ground nesting bees. You want to put in native plants with pithy stems for our stem nesting bees. And we want to reduce mow and have our native grasses. So here is a Bombus fervidus nest is located right in here. And you can see it doesn't take much. This is a very small area that they forgot to mow because of COVID. And our Bombus fervidus queen started a nest here on the surface that was likely an abandoned rodent nest. If they had mowed it, that bee would not be there and we wouldn't have any Bombus fervidus on site, because this is the only tall grass in the area and that's where they nest. So, so we need to think about the nesting as well. So putting it all together then, taking the plants from my list, I'm creating these habitats. I've got one in Southborough, I've got one in Dartmouth, putting in plants, not seeds. And this put them in last spring with the help of volunteers. And despite the fact that it was a hot and dry summer, they got the plants in. As soon as those plants started to bloom, guess who showed up? So these are all pictures of species at risk on plants in these habitats that I created in the first year. And I'll say that that success so this is the end. So showy goldenrod, let's just get the video going here. So this is a Bombus vagans queen. Don't see Bombus vagans queens on any other goldenrods. Here, every showy goldenrod that bloomed, so one in Breakneck Hill in Southborough, the other in Dartmouth, had multiple Bombus vagans queens on it. And I haven't seen them on, you know, Canada goldenrod or any of the other goldenrods. This is the Penstemon hirsutus, the plant species that's in decline as well. This is on all of the sites, including my house, right? Here's Bombus vagans visiting. This is from this spring. And in the same site, also could have taken it for Breakneck. Wait for it. Here's our Bombus fervidus, all over, multiple individuals where we didn't see any before except for on vetch and red clover. So we are pulling them in. The numbers are higher, so I'm doing surveys. It seems like what we did last year, I think it's the mimulus at the Breakneck Hill site has increased the numbers. And so, you know, it's extremely exciting from my perspective. All of the volunteers saw the fervidus show up. They're motivated. Last fall, they had a seed exchange, a winter sow event, growing up the penstemons and other things where they saw the bees, and they're putting them in their yards. And so, you know, it's really motivated them, and it's helping this project to move forward. And I greatly appreciate, you know, everybody's efforts. Everybody is definitely making a difference. There's no question. And so with that, I would like to thank everybody here, and thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Hi, this is Rimonda.
Hi.
I have been watching you. Actually, I'm originally Lebanese. I had been here in the States for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking care of my daughter's garden,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm so much interested in Mother Nature.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have a lot of bees around. And to my surprise, I find, well, we have a small piece of like a wood area, like
Mm-hmm.
no grass, no nothing. It's just nature. Um, I found a lot of bees in the ground. When I dig something, if I'm trying to look for something, I find bees, like black ones, and they're so mean. I got some couple bites, and I usually do whenever I work in the garden. I haven't seen something like that, and we have a problem that we have a lot of nests in the house from the outside in the woods.
So are they in the wood, or are they in the?
We have some in the woods, some like, you know, those woods separated when you separate the two areas. It's very rotten, old
Yeah.
wood.
Yeah, so those are carpenter bees. So they're native. And in terms of the ground nesting, are you sure it's not yellow jacket, it's not wasps? Are you sure it's bees?
Maybe it's wasps. I'm
Right.
not sure.
So wasps and bees are completely separate. So bees, when they're on flowers, are not out to get you in any way. You can, I put them in vials and show people and let them go, and they go right back to the flower. The wasps tend to be a bit more aggressive, but certainly anything where you mess with the nest, there are guard individuals that will come out. But if you want to take a video of whatever it is and send it to me, I can tell you what it is.
I have a lot of bees. I have a lot of different kind of bees. Some of them were yellow, so I thought they are honey bees. Back home we're common with the honeybees, and some in the mountains they raise them. So I'm used to that. But I haven't seen other like the wood bees or something. I have a lot of bees around, so I have. I don't bother them. I just let them go. So I have no issue with the bees. But I don't know if if I can do something more as I
You're
want
right.
to.
So the first thing is that you want to know whether you have the right type of bee. So
Yeah.
it could all be one species. And so what you want to do is if you email me, or I can send my ID guide, or you can take a video and try to ID it through the app to see what species you have. And then, we can go from there. Odds are that you've got a lot of the common species. And so if you look at the plant list that I mentioned, see if you have those plants. And if you don't, you might want to consider putting some of them in, because I know that they will support the species, those species, if they're in the area. So you could try.
I don't have native plants, but I see a lot of bees go around. I have lavender. I have lots of one kind of a plant that I see a lot of. Maybe it's a native plant. I'm not sure. That I see a lot of bees around it. So I see a lot of bees around my plants, but I plant them without thinking if they are native or not. So I see them all around. I have a lot of roses, you know. I have carpet, call it um, carpet roses or something, those little roses. So I have a lot of these, and I have another question that I would love to ask you.
Yeah.
In the woods we have a lot of weeds, and the weeds make nice beautiful flowers. I
Well,
wonder if they are native plants or not.
Well, it depends on what it is. And so weed is, I talked about umwelt, right? So weed is from our perspective. So what may be a weed to us, a lot of people think that milkweed is a weed and they pull it, but in fact, it's extremely valuable from an ecological perspective. So what I would suggest that you do is, there's an app called Seek by iNaturalist, and you can just
Sorry, what
point
is
it at the plant. Seek, SEEK. So you just hold your phone up and it will tell you
Oh
what
yeah, I
species it
have
is.
that. I have it.
Yeah, then
I
go to,
have it.
so do
Yeah.
that, and then go to Go Botany and see if it's a native. And so just make a list. And
Yeah.
if it's a native, then it's not, I wouldn't use the term weed, but
Yeah. Yeah.
if it's a non-native, then you can replace it with something native. That would be my
Well,
suggestion.
actually, it's now it's gone. It was in spring, early spring. Now it's gone. I
Yep.
got app recently, so I would like to. If you, I don't know, maybe I'll email you. I would like to have a list of, or maybe I can Google it, the native plants, and plant them
Yeah.
in my area.
So if you can see my screen down here, this lab
Yeah.
website, Gegear Lab, write that down. If you go there, there's a tab called Plant List, and you can just download the list, PDF of the list, and then you can use that as your guide.
Okay. I did that. So I can plant them maybe in the woods.
You can plant them wherever you
Anywhere,
want.
right?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Another question. Sometimes we spray the yard from mosquitoes
Yeah.
and um, yeah, I don't know if this is good to do that or will
Well, again, it's a relative thing. So mosquitoes are, I appreciate the risk that they pose, but they are extremely valuable food source. And you're not just getting rid of mosquitoes when you do
yeah.
most of the spraying. So, you know, most of the native things, and particularly insects, play an important role and are a food source for a lot of birds and things. So
So you're against spraying anything, you know. But and on the way, being frankly with you, I don't feel any change. When I go out, I get a lot of bites from different kind of insects, and I don't know what they are, and I'm really in a bad shape, you know, with all spraying and stuff like this. And we spray organic things, which I think is not doing that much. So
it may deter for a short period, but yeah, it's, I mean, each person will make their own decision, but certainly from certain perspectives that herbicides and pesticides are restricting diversity or reducing diversity. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll try not to.
It's up
Okay.
to you. All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Rob. There's a couple of questions. Ann Jones asked, how many plants of each species does one need? She's did, you know, 2 hornbeams, 2 oaks, 2 willows, black cherry. She's never seen a caterpillar. She feeds the birds. Is that detrimental? Her neighbors don't spray. You know, what could it be?
So that should be enough to support. So you're looking at host plants. It's related to host. So let me say, in terms of floral resources, for a lot of the solitary species, you know, square meter of floral material is the minimum. I have students working on exact numbers. It's going to vary depending on the species, but that's a minimum that seems to be enough to support at least 1 or 2 bumblebee workers and a bunch of other bees and butterflies. So for host plants, I would say that it's surprising that you would have trees that wouldn't have anything on them. I'll say that. It seems like, you know, for willow, if you've got a half decent sized willow, I mean, I've got small willow, you know, I went to Vermont willow and I had 4 or 5 different species that I put rods into the ground last year, and this year I've got lots of activity in terms of host plant use. So I don't know, could be, if there's a lot of spraying going on, that could be reducing numbers.
It may also be difficult to find what you're looking for. If you have a tall oak, I don't know about you, but it's tough to get up 30 feet into an oak to see what's going on. So.
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I used drones or tried to have used drones to survey bees in the spring, because it's all trees and shrubs in the spring and it's hard to get a handle on who's using what, but.
And I also wanted to know about fireflies, and that's a question that Liza and I have. When she was little, we would look out over our meadow and see dozens and dozens of fireflies. Just the whole meadow would light up. And now we might see 1 or 2 a night, and it's really sad. And is that from people spraying for mosquitoes and ticks? Is it lack of native plants? I mean, what?
Yeah, I think it's so that's out of my wheelhouse a little bit, but I do know that, you know, in that people that blow their leaves, so there's some in urban areas, it's because of I think pesticide use and or chemical use and just maintenance.
Mhm.
The more rural areas, I don't know. The numbers of insects, insect diversity is down globally. So I don't have an answer to the firefly question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Marianne Perry says, thank you.
You're
Let's see
welcome.
if there's any other questions that people might have on the chat. That's it for chat. And if no one else has any other questions, we would all like to thank you so much for your time tonight, your knowledge. It's so incredibly helpful to all of us who are just really trying to learn the best thing we can do in our own yards. And then certainly at Holly Hill Farm to be able to spread your good words, and Jasmine, what she's doing for conservation at the farm. I mean, we just really appreciate your help, and we look forward to seeing you on Saturday.
Yes, I look forward to it as well. And yeah, when you're selecting the natives, go for the obscure, the away from the echinaceas and the mountain mints and the black-eyed Susans that really aren't doing anything, and move more to some of the other species would be. And you can talk to Jasmine about getting those plants.
That's right, at Blue Stem Natives in Norwell.
That's right.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Gegear. We
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate it. Okay.
You're welcome. Okay, have a good night.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.